a joint presentation. I will introduce them in reverse order with Simon Birnbaum, who's going second, is an associate professor and senior lecturer in political science at Södertörn University in Sweden, and an affiliate researcher at the University of Future Studies in Stockholm. He's published extensively on social justice, on basic income, the universal welfare state, and sustainability, and he's written 2 monographs related to those issues, which are Basic Income Reconsidered, Social Justice, Liberalism, and the Demands of Equality. The other book is The Generational Welfare Contract, Justice, Institutions, and Outcomes. Before joining Södertörn University, he has worked as a lecturer and researcher in the Department of Political Science at Stockholm University. Our other member of the presentation team is Jurgen de Wispelaere, who is a true world scholar. He holds a doctorate in social sciences or social policy from the University of Tampere in Finland. He's an assistant professor at the Stockholm School of Economics in Riga, Estonia, and an adjunct professor in philosophy and social policy at Tampere University in Finland. His main areas of expertise is in political theory and public policy, with a particular interest in welfare state research and social protection. Before moving to SSE Riga, he also held visiting or permanent work or fellowships at the University of Bath and the University of Oxford in the United Kingdom, at McGill University and the University of Montreal in Canada, at Trinity College Dublin and University College Dublin in Ireland, at the Southern University of Denmark, at the University Autónoma de Barcelona in Catalonia, Spain, at the Catholic University of Louvain in Belgium, at the Australian National University, at Columbia University in the United States, and he's currently also working as a consultant for the Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean to produce a report on basic income or guaranteed income schemes in Latin America. And he's coming to us today from Valdivia, the city in southern Chile. So from southern Chile, take it away, Jurgen.
Thanks, Karl. Thanks for the invitation. Let me just give me a sec here to share my screen. Hold on a sec here. We have a presentation. Oops. Okay. Can you see this okay? Yes.
Yes, we can see it good.
Great. Okay, so and I'm going to also put my timing thing on so I don't lose total track. Okay, right, great. First of all, Karl and FRIBIS, thanks very much for hosting us and giving us the opportunity to present our paper. So this is going to be, a double presentation between Simon and me. I mean, think of it as a rock concert. So I'm going to be doing the warm-up session, support group. And then the real rock and roll will happen when Simon gets on. And I guess Karl is doing some comments after, so that could be like the, the VIP after party or something like that. So, but we'll have a lot of fun. So this is what we're going to be doing. So we'll look at, I'm going to be talking about some preliminaries, and I'll talk about something that we call the exit strategy. And then Simon will look at 2 sort of big issues that are really the arguments that we have against this sort of exit strategy. So this is sort of the paper that everything is based on, right? So we published a paper 2021 called Exit Strategy or Exit Trap, Basic Income and the Power to Say No in the Age of Precarious Employment. The paper is available for free, so by all means, click the link, look it up and just download it. It's good to have free stuff all the time. The point of this paper really is to engage with the argument proposed by Karl and a number of other people that, that basic income really gives us the power to say no in the context of the labor market. So Simon and I are skeptical about this, but it's very important. I just want to have it on the record that this doesn't mean that we're against basic income. We think basic income is really, really interesting in all sorts of scenarios, right? Not even are we against basic income in the labor market context. We think basic income can do a lot of interesting things in the labor market. So what we are trying to argue against, or at least raise some issues here, is against a very specific type of argument, right? So let's be very clear about this from the start. So what I want to do is I'll go quite fast to some of these preliminaries because I think it's quite familiar to many people. And of course, other Simon, first talk mentioned some of this as well. So what is basic income? Very, very briefly, regular cash transfer, 4 key conditions. It's individual, so it's not based on household. It's universal, so we're not talking about categorical benefits. We're not talking about means testing, at least not in the clean, if you like, pure basic income version. Very importantly, it's unconditional. This, of course, is the condition that raises most of the debate, partly, right? And then, of course, it's also permanent. So this is meant to be the lifelong version. During COVID in the last few years, a lot of people have been talking about a variant of basic income, which is called, temporary basic income or emergency basic income. But that's only meant to last 6 months, a year, maybe a bit longer. What we are talking about here, of course, is the proper version, which is permanent, lifelong, right? So far, so good. Very important, actually. I mean, within that general definition, there's a lot of variety. So basic income isn't just one idea. It really comes in a lot of different versions. And so we can think about different levels of payment, right? So Simon in the previous talk already mentioned a lot about, experiments and pilots that go with the basic income at the level of, say, what's called the living wage, or, the standard of living. Many proposals go below that as well. So we can see variation with that. We can see a lot of variation in terms of how this is going to be funded, right? Is this going to be income tax, VAT, other types of taxation, which programs are going to get cut, and so on and so forth. And that's actually already the third factor. Very, very importantly, basic income can vary a lot in terms of how it interacts with existing policies. So that variation is actually quite important. It's something that's going to come back when we talk, later in the paper, so to speak, or in the presentation, right? So here's one way to think about this. So I like to think of basic income as the platypus of welfare policy. So this is the platypus, right? It was very, very strange, cute little animal. So why do I think about this? Well, basic income is made up of different parts that all look very, very familiar from other types of policies. So you see that in the platypus, right? There's a little bit of different animals that seems to be, fitted together in a single thing. So we're very tempted to think that we know what basic income is and does based on how it looks like other policies. But when you put all these things together, you really, really do get a very unique type of policy, the same way the platypus is a very weird, unique type of animal. And of course, it's something that also invokes very strong reactions, right? Some people think it's the best thing ever, and some people absolutely hate it, right? So this is sort of, thinking of basic income as the platypus of welfare policy has these components. It's very, very familiar, but when you really think about it, it's really, really unique, right? And it's one of the reasons why, maybe one of the reasons why people insist on doing all these pilots to really know how it's supposed to be working, right? One of the interesting things, as I've already mentioned, basic income comes in variations, if you like. So when we start thinking about questions like, what is it that the basic income is doing? Should we have it? It is really important to be specific about what type of basic income we are talking about. So Brian Berry, a philosopher who passed away, I'm trying to think now when, about a decade ago, I'd say. He had this quote where he basically says, asking about the pros or cons of basic income is like asking about the pros or cons of keeping a feline as a pet without distinguishing between a tiger and tabby. So details matter. Again, this is a point that will come back when Simon starts really discussing the sort of objections we have to the exit strategy, right? So that by way of introduction around basic income. So let's now think about this thing called exit strategy. So the background to our paper is, as we said, is this idea of the power to say no. Basic income gives workers the power to say no, which means it improves their bargaining power, by allowing them to exit or threatening to exit unless the employer meets certain demands, better pay, better working conditions, health and safety, not having to go to the boss's dinner parties, and so on and so forth, you name it, right? And here are just a couple of examples of people who've been making this claim. I mean, the middle is Karl's book, and Karl really pitched this power to say no point in the debate, but since then a lot of people really picked this up, right? So that's the background, and intuitively that seems a really interesting thing, right? So I mean, it really makes basic income this very sort of empowering, transformative type of thing. So it looks great and it sounds great and it smells great, if you like, right? So but let's dig a little bit deeper. So first of all, what is exit from employment? So we can actually distinguish three types of exit, and it's worthwhile keeping these in the background when we are sort of investigating this sort of issue. The first one we call weak exit. So weak exit is when you either temporarily or partially want to exit an employment relation. So for example, this means some people have a preference for part-time work, so you want to leave your full-time job and move to a part-time one. Some people want to take time out to retrain, to educate themselves. They want to take a personal sabbatical to focus on family, sick family member, take time off to be with the kids, you name it, right? There could be all sorts of reasons. But we call this weak exit because people really do still want to stay in the labor market, and they actually still want to stay with the same employer, provided they can, take some time out or reduce the time that they have to spend on the job, right? So that's weak exit. Then a stronger one, which we call strong exit. Of course, we're not getting any points here for, coming up with sexy names, but, weak exit, moving to strong exit. So this is exit from a specific employment relationship, a specific business or boss you work for, with the objective of looking for and accepting a different job, a better job. So very importantly, this is still, these people that want to go with strong exit have a preference for being in employment or for continuing to be in employment, right? They just don't like their particular work, their particular boss, and they just want to move around with that and hopefully get a better one, right? This is to be distinguished from radical exit, the much stronger form. Radical exit means that you exit the labor market altogether. You just refuse to become involved in any type of employment relation. So those are the people who may have a preference for self-employment. They don't want to work for someone else. They may have a preference for saying, look, I want to basically engage in meaningful voluntary work, right? I think all this work stuff is really not very helpful. There's all sorts of things we can do that is much more beneficial socially, personally, perhaps. Let's do this on a voluntary basis. Some people really want to go off the grid entirely, right? They go live on a little island, have their vegetable garden, have 2 chickens and a goat, and that's it. They're very happy with that, right? So what you see here is 3 different types of exit associated with, in a way, if you like, 3 different types of preference profiles, right? So it's important to keep these things separate in the background. So we now know what is exit, but what is the exit strategy, right? The exit strategy is something very specific. So the exit strategy involves an expressed readiness to leave one's present employer and look elsewhere for a better job, right? So there's a willingness to actually exit this particular employment relationship, and that exit is expressed. It's really people want to make it clear and saying that that is what we're doing. It's interesting to compare this with a strike. So if you want, in the exit strategy, you want to quit the job, but you don't want to quit work altogether, right? This is very different from a strike, which Gurevich, a scholar who's been working on this topic on strikes, he basically calls strikes quitting work, not the job. When you were on strike, you're putting your work down, but you still have the same relationship with the same employer. Right? So exit strategy and strike are sort of opposites in one sense, if you like, right? So the idea of a strategic exit is that it really is a bargaining strategy. So people here are retaining a preference for and a connection to the labor market. That's really key, but they want to bargain with their specific employer, right? So what that means is we are really, in this case, focusing on what we called before strong exit. So it's not so much about weak exit, the temporary leaving type of thing, it's not that important, nor is it, very importantly, nor is it radical exit. This is not people who are happy to just leave the workforce, right? These are people who, ideally speaking, want to stay in the workforce. They just want to either get a better deal from their current boss or want to move to a different one who offers them a better deal. Right? Okay. And it is really important because to the extent, and this is the point that Simon will work on a bit more, or we'll talk about a bit more, to the extent that, for example, exit means that you end up outside of the workforce under these sort of type of preferences, that's a problem, right? I mean, if what you want is have a better job, ending being unemployed, it's not a good thing, right? That's not really what you want. Okay. So another final point then, key to the exit strategy is also the exit threat. So is the idea that you're willing to leave if certain conditions are not met, but mainly it's the idea that that's what you want to express. So you literally go to your boss in your job and knock on the door and saying that, here you go, I really insist on having better pay or some extra holiday or better health and safety in work, better food at work, you name it. And if not, I will take my business, i.e. my labor market, my labor power elsewhere. That is the threat, right? Okay, so sort of a little point here. Some of you, or many of you, may be familiar with Albert Hirschman's sort of famous work on exit versus voice, right? So the idea is that, you can complain about things by exiting, voting with your feet, or you can complain about things by voicing complaints and entering some sort of deliberation and discussion. So it's very important. And when we talk about the exit threat, although you're using your voice, so to speak, your expression, it is really part of exit, not of voice. Why? Because at the end of the day, this is action oriented. I mean, you're expressing a willingness to leave. What is really doing the work, so to speak, is the leaving part. It's still voting with the feet, right? So 2 more slides and then I'm done here. Why exits? Why do we do all these things? So very, very briefly, there are conventional strategies for empowering vulnerable workers, things that are already happening in different countries. So employment regulation is one thing. So the state comes in and basically says, look, we're going to put in laws that regulate hiring, firing, working conditions, payments, promotions, you name it, everything. Okay, one option. At the radical end of this, there could be prohibition of certain jobs, could even be prohibition of working for certain types of people. So, for example, sex work in many countries is prohibited. Working for the mafia is usually not the sort of thing that government like very much either. So there's prohibitions as a possible regulation strategy. And then, of course, thirdly is representation or voice. This is often associated with trade unions, and often this is collective, right? So one of the interesting aspects, of course, is that exit is an individual type of feature, and representation in a way is often collective. We're much stronger when we do this together, and so on and so forth. So why not just stick with these three? Well, because people have identified problems with this, right? So, for example, vulnerable workers can be jeopardized in all sorts of ways, right? They have different interests, and it's often hard for, say, a state and employment regulation to keep track in all these ways. It's often hard, for example, for collective representation to necessarily be able to bargain on all these different things, right? It also can create insider-outsider competition and opposition. So, for example, we have trade unions that represent their own workers, but each trade union represents a different sector or represents a different group of workers within a sector, and so on and so forth. So you get competition, potentially. And then, of course, there's issues around complexity of rules and monitoring, bureaucratic discretion, possibility of bias and corruption, and so on and so forth. You put all these three together, the people who favor exit basically say that means that, the solutions of employment regulation or prohibition or representation are less than optimal. We need something else. That something else is exit. So how is that meant to work? Well, of course, exit, some types of workers already have a very strong bargaining position. If you work in a factory that has a big expensive machine and you're the only one who can work that machine, you can write your own ticket, right? I mean, you can go to the office of the boss and say, now look, you know, I really need more money, I need more vacation, whatever. It's fine, you're going to get it. Of course, many people, and this is especially when we're thinking about precarious employment, many people don't have this. So the argument is that we need to give them something to further their bargaining position, their exit power, right? Their exit freedom. And that is supposed to be basic income. So what is the problem of basic income? Basic income, you know, this is a quote from Philip Pettit, who, you know, wrote about this specific issue. And he basically says, well, the most effective of all protections in the labor market would be one's ability to leave employment and fall back on a basic wage available unconditionally from the state, i.e. basic income. So how is this meant to work? Well, basic income is simple, it's universal, it's non-intrusive. By implication, that means it doesn't leave anyone behind, there's no gaps, there's no uncertainty. So it is this very strong floor. So in theory, at least, and you know, we'll see whether the theory holds up, but in theory, at least, basic income allows workers to leave a job or turn down a job offering with poor working conditions. It does this in two ways. It provides what we call a bridging income, right? That allows a transition. So if you're looking for another job, you could basically, you know, you basically could leave your one boss and then use basic income as a bridging income in order to transition to the next one. It could also be a fallback position in case no other job is to be found. So those are the two mechanisms, if you like, right? There's the bridging of positions and there's the fallback position. So that, in a nutshell, is how basic income fits with different types of exit and with the exit strategy. And now we're going to move to our critique of all this, and that is on to Simon. So Simon, I will leave it to you now.
So let's move on then to our reservations in relation to this argument. What Jurgen has just said here, it's clearly it sounds very attractive. So why on earth would we like to challenge this kind of argument? Now the claim being made here by a number of authors is that a basic income would really help drive fundamental changes in the labor market. Basic income, a realistic basic income introduced within existing capitalist structures. And the first step of our criticism of this argument is to introduce certain arguments about the potential insufficiency of the basic income for providing an empowering exit option. So suppose we introduce a basic income. Would that be sufficient for empowering workers, for enabling workers really to improve their working conditions, for providing the threat of exit in a way that would boost their labor market prospects? Well, the first thing we do here is to identify a number of obstacles to exit that would remain in place, even if there is a basic income. So we discuss four main problems here that a basic income on its own can't really solve or address. Suppose we have a basic income. And we assume, I mean, realistically, that this would have to be a relatively meager basic income. Then employment would still be a gateway to other social rights. Pension entitlements, earnings-related social insurance, some countries' health insurance. So if I have a partner, when we have a child together and my partner comes home saying, look, I will jeopardize pension entitlements. I will jeopardize access to earnings-related parental leave and earnings-related unemployment and insurance and so on, because now there is this basic income to rely on. Then I wouldn't be super enthusiastic. I don't know about you, but I mean, a responsible option would clearly be to be a bit cautious here. This would still be in play. And of course, as Jurgen mentioned, this clearly depends a lot on details and background context. So we're assuming here that that the basic income would have to be a partial basic income if it's supposed to be realistic. Another set of obstacles are related to the potential scarring effects of unemployment. Suppose we say no to an unattractive job. We dislike our job. We want to leave. Now, how will this affect our future labor market prospects? Clearly, we depend on our incomes, and there's a risk here that this step, I mean, exiting, would be perceived as it's a lack of ambition. If we leave in the context of a conflict with our employer, for instance, we may jeopardize, the possibility to get a good reference. There is a risk that we will lose our networks, that there will be kind of skill depreciation, that we will end up in a situation where we lose self-confidence, and it will be more difficult in the future to get a new job. Another thing to observe here is that typically the location of a job typically matters a lot to employees. So even if we would like a different job, there are practical obstacles for relocating. We depend on local family or neighborhood networks, and those networks are typically hard to replace or build up. Perhaps, a child has a good school, we don't want to leave that, or perhaps we need to attend to a frail parent or grandparent, and so on. So these are, also important social and economic obstacles for actually saying no to a job or rejecting a job, even if there is a basic income to rely on. Another aspect concerns the non-instrumental goods of work. So now many basic income proponents, of course, challenge what Philip van Parijs has referred to as the work fetishism of our societies. We may want that employment shouldn't be so important to us, to our sense of recognition and esteem, but still it is. If our reference group is kind of firmly steeped in this job-oriented culture, well, there tends to be a certain stigma or sense of shame attached to potential joblessness, and that is likely to hold people back when it comes to actually opting for exit, even if there is a meager basic income to rely on then. So there is a risk here. If we decide to take this risk, that we decide to leave or threaten to leave, there is a risk that this will actually be an end point. It's not just a bridge, but that will actually get stuck in this state of unemployment. And this takes us to what we refer to as a hollow threat objection to basic income induced exit. That is really key. If this is supposed to be empowering, this basic income and the threat of exit, it really needs to be a credible threat. And as we've seen, then workers will face a number of obstacles for exiting that basic income does not resolve. And if this is common knowledge, if everyone or most people, we're aware of these obstacles, these constraints, if there are good reasons to think that workers won't actually leave, they may complain and so on, but it's unlikely that they will actually leave. Even if there's a basic income, employers will have no incentive beyond mere goodwill to actually improve employment conditions. So that's the first step of our argument, discussing, various reasons for, thinking that under realistic conditions, exit is actually likely to be a hollow threat. But we also want to take the argument one step further, and here's when we introduce the concept of an exit trap. So the weak version of our argument simply points to a number of reasons to think that the basic income might have rather limited effect or might be insufficient for providing a solid foundation for an exit strategy. This is the hollow threat objection. But there's also then a stronger version of the argument that it might even be the case that basic income could turn into an exit trap. Even though in the abstract it sounds very, promising, empowering, it might actually end up worsening the prospects of precarious workers relative to the status quo. Now that might sound strange, isn't that just, nonsense? Just think of it. Think that, okay, so we introduce a partial basic income gradually as this becomes kind of feasible, and surely people's bargaining power would be greater if they have, even if it's a meager basic income, that surely provides greater bargaining power relative to a situation where they don't have any basic income. David Kalnitsky has provided some experimental evidence from the Mincome context in the late 70s from Canada, the saturation site of that experiment, suggesting that the access to a guaranteed income that seemed to have a positive impact on wages, pushing wages upwards. So why would we make this argument that basic income would actually worsen conditions, turn into an exit trap? Well, first of all, if we look more closely at how this argument is presented by some of the key proponents of the exit argument, then it's very often presented as an alternative to the collective bargaining power of vulnerable workers. Our approach to this is that we want to take this seriously, as a realistic policy tool. But then there are certain achievability constraints that are not, these are not soft constraints. They're not likely to go away. They're pretty hard constraints that are budgetary constraints. That you want to provide a basic income that's actually economically achievable, but also political constraints. It's rather unlikely that we will have a basic income party, a radical basic income party that in a democratic election will gain a majority, that we could form a government with this, basic income party. That doesn't seem very likely that this will actually happen. Basic income proponents or proponents of this kind of argument have often said that what we need to see here is that the basic income should form part of a new social consensus where we accept that we have a basic income, but in return, then employers and pro-market oriented persons can embrace this, because we could have greater elements of deregulation and also elements of wage flexibility. So we can have a certain new type of compromise. And many of these contributions that Jurgen mentioned, Taylor, for instance, when making this argument, exit left, they really point to the limitations of collective bargaining, the role of labor unions. And we feel that there is a need here to bring back this discussion, to relate this discussion more systematically to the insights, the empirically grounded insights of comparative welfare state research. Now, whatever we may think about labor unions and class mobilizations, we shouldn't downplay the limitations of union-based strategies and some of the dangers involved in relying exclusively on such strategies. However, it's hard to dispute the firm empirical connection between class mobilization, that collective bargaining power, direct voice strategies, and decommodification. So if you look at the countries where we can actually see that we have accessed social rights that provide people with high levels of personal independence, bargaining power in relation to the labor market, well, that tends to be in countries where this collective bargaining power, direct voice strategies have been very pronounced. So we think that insight often is kind of absent in this discussion. Another thing to observe here is that when this claim is made, in our current in the contemporary context, the claim is made against the background of globalized slack labor markets, where, I mean, there's fierce competition for precarious jobs, right? So for every precarious worker that threatens to exit, there are scores of others waiting to take the vacant job. And there's also, we need to take a look at, have a closer look that on the conditions and alternatives for precarious workers. Suppose I have this job. If I'm going to press this, I advance this exit strategy. If I don't get improved working conditions, I will leave. Well, that only makes sense if there are other jobs available, other better jobs available. But precarious workers, if you look at the empirical literature, often tend to move horizontally rather than vertically in the labor market. So either, I mean, you could exit and you get unemployed, or get a similar kind of job that you had previously. And if we have that context in mind, it's interesting also to introduce these considerations about the impact of automation and technological unemployment. Often we hear that automation, artificial intelligence, digital innovations, these processes are, provide us with arguments for why a basic income is really promising and perhaps even necessary. In this context, though, there's an interesting interaction here between the bargaining power argument, the exit strategy as a basis for improved bargaining power, and these processes of automation. Because if there is low-cost technology available that would actually allow employers to do without precarious workers, then making the exit threat in such a context, in such a situation, may actually turn the basic income into an unemployment subsidy. So remember that the idea of strategic exit, it's made by people. I mean, the strategy is used here by people who really want to have a job. They want to have an attractive job to improve their prospects within the labor markets. And if this is what actually would happen, it's clearly not an improvement, that you would end up with a meager basic income in a condition of involuntary unemployment, being replaced by new technology. So these are the main considerations advanced in our paper for how this seemingly empowering solution might actually become counterproductive in relation to this objective of improving bargaining power for vulnerable workers. Now, are there ways to prevent the basic income from becoming part of an exit trap? Well, of course, we may want to use these scenarios and these potential risks and awareness of these risks constructively to flesh out the case for basic income in a way that would avoid these problems. For instance, we could really emphasize that we shouldn't have just a partial, modest basic income, but we really need to have a full basic income, offering a respectable, culturally defined standard of living. We could also emphasize that we would like to have a variety of social services in addition to the full basic income. It's really important that we could have investment in human capital. So if people can, in addition to the basic income, they can access high quality care. They could access free university education, high quality lifelong learning. They could get support for job matching, relocation, and things like that. That clearly would bolster the exit option, wouldn't it? And we may also want to develop new structures, new infrastructure of participation beyond the employment contract, strengthen opportunities for cultural work, unpaid care work, volunteering, to make employment less central for esteem and recognition. So more people in such a context might want to opt for what Jurgen referred to as radical exit. We may also want to emphasize that we shouldn't see this kind of individual exit as an alternative to collective bargaining. We should combine individual exit with direct voice strategy to ensure that they are really mutually reinforcing. That's a possibility explored by Eric Olin Wright, for instance, suggesting that if many people individually would opt for exit, having this full basic income to fall back on, then that could lead to a kind of wage escalation. Employers would fear a chaotic situation, and they would welcome strong unions to have an ordered situation, and to avoid inflationary pressures and so on. So taken together, these mechanisms would actually support collective bargaining power and so on. So in relation to this kind of scenario, I mean, this seems rather attractive. But this way of thinking, it really is more part of a real utopian considerations. Thinking about long-term aspirations in a rather speculative way can be a source of inspiration, imagination, but it seems really clear that we don't, in this kind of vision, doesn't really tell us how a modest, realistic basic income phased in within existing capitalist structure would actually bring us closer to this kind of situation that would actually help trigger or support the dynamics envisaged by Eric Olin Wright and others. And perhaps just a final remark on this, another point that we make in relation to these alternatives. I mean, in this type of scenario, relating back to some of Kalnitsky's results, it's kind of interesting if we think that actually in this situation where it's actually become realistic for people to partly opt out of work, that people opt for radical exit, for instance, or people go for weak exit. Perhaps they spend more time, take longer parental leave, or they go into university studies, or they do other things. Now that might reduce competition for precarious jobs, and that might have the effect, that's a possibility, of actually increasing wages, improving conditions. If it might be possible to boost these kinds of processes, yes, we see that, well, there is a possibility perhaps that you could improve conditions for precarious workers. But we make a conceptual point here. I mean, what would be the mechanisms in this case? Well, the mechanism would be that this would be kind of the aggregate effects of impersonal forces of supply and demand. It would not be the effect of people saying that, I mean, making an explicit exit threat. So unless I get better wages, higher wages, or more meaningful work, I will leave. That's not what happens in this scenario. But it's really more the outcome of some people, increasing groups of people opting for weak exit or even radical exit that might help boost the prospects of vulnerable workers. That's a possibility. But yeah, and I think that's I'll stop there and open up for discussion.
Okay, thank you very much, Simon. Please unshare your screen. All right, now for my response. Well, I think these are very interesting ideas that Jurgen and Simon have put forth. But I think there is actually really nothing here that is an argument against anything that I have said in my work on the power to say no. And if you were to try to apply it to say this is actually an argument against what I'm saying in these arguments, would be the naturalistic fallacy. Because what I'm looking at in this book is what is a just society. And what I argue is that, well, there's maybe a lot of things we need for a just society, but one of those, it is not enough to get away, to get rid of chattel slavery. But we also need to get rid of indirectly forced labor and indirectly forced other forms of subordination, such as a woman's subordination to a husband who holds power or who holds financial power over her. And what I'm saying is that if we don't do these things, our society is horribly unjust. If you say, well, these things aren't politically feasible in the short run or in the medium run or in the long run, that just says that our society is now and will be for the foreseeable future a horribly unjust society. It would not be a response to Frederick Douglass in 1861 to tell him, well, it's not real. I know you say you want full end of white supremacy and truly embrace of Black people as the full equals of white people, so there's no disadvantage whatsoever and be born with dark skin. Well, that's not politically feasible. Now it won't even be politically feasible in 2022. The best we can do is eliminate slavery and make you all second-class citizens. That must be right. Well, that's not telling Frederick Douglass is wrong. That's just telling Frederick Douglass what an incredibly unjust society he lives in, and maybe telling some Black activists today how incredibly unjust our society is, which I think many of them are already aware of. So it's not really an argument of against what I'm saying here. Now, what it is then, what it is, since it's not really an argument against what I'm saying, it is a theory of second best. It could be used at least in a theory of second best. So, okay, if assuming you agree that a truly just society would not be forcing people to work, and that's not feasible, and a basic income would be a very good tool to make it so we weren't indirectly forcing people to work with a choice of bosses. Since that's not feasible, it is not necessarily true that creating a really small basic income that doesn't give them that power is the next best step in that direction from a political perspective. It's a theory of second best. I'm going to say a perfectly competitive market would all have all these great features to say, well, and one of those features is no government regulation. So we have this horribly horribly uncompetitive market and government regulations. You just get rid of the government regulations. That's one of the things that creates a perfectly competitive market. But since you don't have a perfectly competitive market, those government regulations might be counteracting some of the other problems that exist in the market. So just getting rid of those government regulations, even though that's one of the things that is a characteristic of a perfectly competitive market, doesn't necessarily get you there. So it's a theory of second best of what, since a really just society isn't achievable, what is a step in the direction of justice that we might be able to take, and that is not necessarily the creation of a basic income or a basic income as high as we could realistically get it. Now that gets me to other comments. I think that you're unduly pessimistic about what is possible, because we never really know what's possible. The only thing we know is possible is the status quo. We don't know whether it's what changes in the status quo are possible. We don't know if it's possible to increase the child tax credit by $1, and also people who want it lowered don't know whether it's physically possible to lower it by $1. We don't really know what's feasible. The question is about trying and trying, and as Frederick Douglass says, you got to agitate and keep agitating and keep agitating. When you live in an unjust society, and I think sometimes things that seem politically a complete political non-starters change. In the 1850s, it didn't look like we were going to be, 20 years from now, we were going to have a society in the United States, we're going to have a society without slavery. But it happened. In 1925, it did not look like by 1945, the United States, it didn't look seen at all politically feasible. The United States was going to have a pretty decent social welfare system by 1945, but it happened. In the 1970s, and then 1980s, when I was growing up, the guaranteed income looked a lot more politically feasible. It looked like on the edge of political feasibility in the early 1970s, but same-sex marriage looked completely impossible. So sometimes what we think looks impossible actually becomes possible way quicker than we think it would be. If you polled people in 1970, which is going to happen first, same-sex marriage or negative income tax? Negative income tax would have won that like 95% to 5, and they'd all been wrong. I don't think we should let pessimism about what's possible hold us back from agitating about what's coming up. Now, but also, so now those are another thing is that I realized from reading your paper the first time, I realized that I was speaking about this really in a particular setting, and that a particular setting and a particular thought about the labor market, that setting was I'm responding to the argument that, if you could create basic income, nobody will work, or at least somebody won't work, and that's horrible. It's horrible, terrible that if you introduce a basic income and people don't work. Actually, it's not so horrible, because we've got really crap jobs right now, and people ought to have the power to say no to them. Now, your argument could be just as much a response to those people, just as mine is, to those people who say basic income is going to cause everybody to leave the labor market. Well, actually, it's not going to cause many people to leave the labor market if you put in the kind of basic income that we're likely to get. But their response to that, well, the camel gets his nose under the tent, and pretty soon the whole camel's inside the tent. They've got a response to your sort of an argument, whether it's realistic or not, I don't know. But that's the sort of response they would give to you. But if that is the kind of argument that I'm entering when I bring this, and that actually was really left out of your look at this, not even looking at that angle of argumentation against basic income. It went on to say, well, does it achieve all these things I want? Well, even if it doesn't achieve all these things, if it relieves the suffering of the people at the bottom, it's an important step in the right direction. And I'll take any sort of the people at the bottom are being treated so unjustly. I'll take any step at that. But another thing that I realized, one thing that I really realized from reading your paper about is that I was looking at the labor market. Not only was I responding to a particular record, but I was looking at the labor market in a particular way. And you open up to my looking at it in a different way, but also you're not looking at it in the way that I am. You're looking at an uncompetitive labor market where there's lots of bargaining power, perhaps at least on one side, maybe on both sides. I was really more thinking about a competitive labor market. Now, I'm not necessarily a perfectly competitive labor market, but a competitive labor market in the sense that both buyers and sellers just buy at the going rate in most occasions. There's usually no benefit in raising wages because you get the same employers with the same skills, and it just costs you more and your profits go down if you're an employer. And there's no benefit in really lowering the wages much below the going wage because there's so many other employers that people could work for. Even though there's some workers unemployed all the time, they're going to be looking for people to pay the going wage. Thinking about going wage, And I think actually the lower you get in the market, the more it's competitive, because you've got lots of jobs where the training doesn't work right. The same people can work in a meat packing plant as can work in the service industry and work as janitors and work as lots of other things. There are many of these people now, but people portray competitive markets as being good, but there's nothing necessarily good about them, because all the competitive market means is you get the going rate. Well, if the going rate is based on some really rich people looking to increase their profits and a whole large pool of other people who are going to be homeless if they don't get a job pretty soon, the going wage rate is going to be very low. So I'm not thinking really about what you were talking about, weak exit or strategic exit or radical exit, but more like what I would call casual exit, that there are no jobs that I'd rather have than living off basic, assuming the basic income is large enough to live on, even if it's not very good, not one that a middle class worker would use strategically, but one that a very low class worker would just prefer to working in a meatpacking industry, which used to be good jobs and now really terrible jobs. That sort of thing. If I would prefer this to the jobs available to me, I will take that job. I'm not really thinking so much strategically, but this idea, where coming from the people who are opposed to basic income, that, well, there are people who might not work. Well, if there are people who won't work when they've got a poverty line income or just a little more than that, which is a really low income, there are people who do not like the job offers at that point, and they choose not to. That is a good thing from their point, because we shouldn't be forcing them to take those jobs. And I'm just thinking about people who, maybe if a better offer comes along, I'll take it. We'll see what the job offers are. It's not that I'm opposed to working. It's not that I've made a big decision about it. But just that I don't like the job offers. Not so much strategic. It's just that the job offers I don't like, or the offers I see I don't like. Now, for the people who might be able to be, but whatever, I should have paid more attention to these two sort of different motivations, to the strategic motivation. I said really very little about the strategic motivation, but I don't think the individual power that UBI gives you is in any way opposed to the collective power that unionization gives you, and I think it inherently strengthens it for reasons that Eric Olin Wright talked about. Right now, unions have to save a lot of money to create a strike fund, so their workers aren't going to lose their apartment while they go on strike. And what tends to break a strike is if a company can hold out so that strike fund is exhausted. If a UBI is large enough to live on, the strike fund is inexhaustible, and they can stay on strike for a long time. They don't need to save up to do it. It becomes more cheaper to form a union. I also would think about back to the more competitive market. We have a situation in the United States, it might be particularly the United States, where although some things are tied to employment, some other things, it's harder to get those things that are tied to employment. Those tend to come in at a higher level. You get a lot of people who have to, in order to make ends meet, have to work 3 part-time jobs that was actually working overtime. You work 60 hours a week for 20 hours at 3 jobs, and that way, none of those employers have to pay your health insurance. And you're working 20 hours more than the standard work week. You're working overtime, and you're considered part-time everywhere you work. Someone like that, even with a relatively small basic income, might be able to quit one of those jobs. And quitting one of those jobs might actually have a significantly effect on the wages and working conditions in those low-paid sectors. How much it will, I don't know. But if anybody is able to do that, it's helping to relieve the suffering of some of the worst off people, not to mention the homeless. And so I think even if the basic income that's politically feasible is a lot lower than what I think is really just and what I argue is just, I think we should be moving in this direction. And I'll let you guys respond and then go to open questions. That's a lot to respond to. You might not want to respond to all of that.
Okay. Well, Karl, thanks very much for all that. So yeah, I'll pick a few points and then I'll leave the hard stuff to Simon. Yeah. So, okay. I mean, so first of all, I mean, you know, you've made several points that basically boil down to the fact that you're doing different stuff that we're doing, and you know, and to some extent that's fine. I mean, you talk VHS and we talk Betamax or the other way around, and you know, and we're perfectly happy to accept that. And I think, in fairness to us, there's nothing in our paper that says that we're now writing a paper against Karl Widerquist or against Karl Widerquist's idea, right? So I think yes, there is a difference between thinking in terms of whatever you know, ideal type theory of justice and the power to say no is part of that, and so on and so forth, which is what you do. And then, but there are quite a few people. You know, I mean, you may not have intended it this way, but there's quite a few people who've either taken, let's say, the one line version of, you know, of your account, you know, the power to say no, or that have come up with it separately and then just use the terminology, so to speak. There's quite a few people who are making claims that really do boil down to strategic exit type of thing. So I mean, you know, I mean, it's perfectly fine what you're doing. It's also, we think at least, it's perfectly fine what we're doing and saying that, hold on, if you're making these sort of claims about what basic income is really doing today and can be doing today, then we need to be really, really serious about looking at what is really happening or likely to happen, and so on and so forth. So again, I mean, you know, one thing that's quite important in our paper is we're not even that interested in sort of hacking strategic exit or the exit option apart, so to speak, right? Like we're not fundamentally saying, you know, this whole strategic option thing is a total doofus, and you know, we should just leave it, and by implication we should leave basic income and out of the labor market and so on. We don't actually, we're quite explicit in the paper that we're not doing this. So what is it that we're doing? Well, one of the ways to read what we're trying to do is to say, if we're taking exit options today seriously, if we're taking the strategic side of it also seriously today, right, then a number of things follow. So one of the things that follows, for example, is that we need to start really looking into, for example, what are the potential impact of basic income in terms of strategic bargaining for very, very different types of workers in very, very different types of sectors, right? And I'm pretty sure, Karl, that you agree with that statement, right? Mm-hmm. But no one is doing it yet, right? We're at a stage when it comes to this line of argument where either we're doing the stuff that you're doing, which is we're talking about theories of justice and how that fits in there, which is fine, or people are making very general claims, very, very general claims, and they try to generalize, and it's like, well, we have basic income in the labor market, and therefore some people may choose to take the money and run, so to speak, and therefore this creates the power to say no for everyone. Like I'm making a caricature, right? But I mean, you know, you and I and Simon as well, we've been doing this for a couple of decades now. Every basic income argument goes through the phase where it is a theory proposition, and then it becomes very generalized, and then we start doing the research where we start really into the nitty-gritty, and how is this really supposed to work? How does it work in different types of labor market? How does it work with different types of workers? How does it work in different sectors? How does it work in different countries with different welfare states? And so on and so forth. So in a way, if you like, you can read our argument to say, if we want to take the exit option seriously today, that's where we need to move now. We need to do a lot of work to really try to figure out. And in a way, our paper offers a number of reasons to be a bit skeptical about high-level generalization, so to speak, right? So if you will, that's one way, I think, in which our research agendas are compatible, even if they don't directly speak to each other. I hope that makes sense. So.
Yeah, it does. And I should say, I haven't given enough thought to the higher level workers, because really the worker who has a genuine exit option, who actually they can live off the money and live decently, and so what because the justification of the power to say no is just like, well, if you take a job, it should be well enough that you would take it even though you have this option. That job still might be unjust because you're not getting an equitable share of society's product for your labor, and how high does basic income have to be? So once you get beyond that point, you're talking about basic income as a tool for something more than giving people independence, but also creating a more equal and equitable society. Can basic income do that? That's an important question. It's not been my main area of concern. I think it can, and I do agree with you that it's got to get higher and higher to do that. For the most part, I agree with. I also do agree with you that the market is competitive in some ways and not so much in other ways. That often, if you raise the income of the lowest tier and improve their working conditions, then the next tier finds it easier to demand higher, and so forth, and it can cascade up from like that. So that, in a sense, I do think it is a tool to fight inequality, but I also think it might be introduced at a level that's too low to be a very effective tool to fight inequality, as well as it could be introduced too low to really establish a realistic independence.
So let me thank you also, Karl, for these comments. My general thoughts and impressions were similar to those of Jurgen. I mean, when I listened to you, I felt that, I mean, we're not engaging here with kind of an ideal theory type of argument, obviously, I fully agree with what you're saying, that we mustn't let pessimism hold us back, and it's obviously really important with ideal theory type of exercises. I've been involved in those kinds of debates myself quite a lot, and I mean, trying to kind of push the limits of our imagination and I mean identify paths forward. I mean to identify desirable futures. But I also think that it's I mean, the claims we're making in this argument, in this particular argument, it's something very specific. It's on this particular idea of phasing in a realistic form of basic income within existing capitalist structures. Would that actually bring us closer to such an idea? I think it's really important to address these kinds of claims, whether or not you make those claims. I mean, this is really not. Yeah. I mean, we like your phrase very much. This power just to say no. It's a very good expression, of course, but it is clearly a staple in basic income discourse, and this general idea of basic income as a foundation for boosting bargaining power. I mean, the power to say no, and so I think it's important to address these kinds of ideas and claims in a sober and empirically informed way. I mean, if we share the same kind of values clearly here, but I mean, if we want to get closer to a more ideal state, we want to get there, but we also want to stay there. We don't want to just to end up in a situation where our efforts become counterproductive. And I think there's kind of, I mean, I think it's important to bring in comparative welfare state research in this context. And even though perhaps you're not making these kinds of claims, but I do think that both Lovett and Taylor and others are making them. I mean, where people are, you know, really present exit and individual exit as an alternative to well, union power, collective bargaining power, I think they do run into some of these the difficulties that we are pointing to here. And I mean, for instance, if you look at Philippe van Parijs, if you look at, I mean, his way of addressing some of these questions and proposing basic income as a foundation for a new kind of social consensus, he really thinks about this as something that would allow us. And Friedman was mentioned in the earlier talk here. Move beyond regulation, to move beyond union power, and also to enable wage flexibility. And I think there is I mean, if we do introduce this kind of realistic low basic income gradually as an alternative to more traditional conventional measures with a greater emphasis on collective bargaining power, as he proposes, well, then we may not only we have a situation where we kind of accept precarization processes, but we also tend to accelerate them, right? That we'll have more low-paid jobs, we'll have and a situation where, I mean, certain key mechanisms that help to kind of shape but also sustain more egalitarian arrangements are weakened. I mean, there's a very clear risk there that I think this type of argument is not sufficiently sensitive to. So yeah, it's just
okay. Okay, now we have two people in the queue with questions. So first we have Simon Ma. Simon?
Yep, doing it. Hi.
All right.
So thank you guys for the paper and the talk. And it's really just, I really appreciate that you ask the questions that a lot of people don't seem to ask in detail. And I like that kind of research, really appreciate it. I was wondering about the research of David Kalnitsky, because he does it especially in the MinCom pilot, and as much as I remember that paper, he basically claims that he was able to see that social stigma doesn't seem to seems to lower over time, and so I wondered how you're able to pick this up, especially because one of the strongest claims, and I totally agree to that in that sense, that is social stigma, which prevents people from exiting jobs. But how does that research / that claim tie into what you are arguing?
So Kalnitsky basically researched, I mean, the research of Kalnitsky that ties into our paper is not that paper, right? He's written several. He also did a paper where he actually looks at the, very specifically the link between employees and employers. That's the one you want to read. Okay. In order to understand how because we have an ongoing debate with David Kalnitsky, basically, right? So he's a lot more optimistic than us. But one of the things that, we find ourselves slowly converging on sort of, if you like, an agreement where, if you like, there are different mechanisms. So there's a threatening, bargaining type of mechanism, and then there's the aggregate effect of people actually exiting. Right. And so one of the really interesting things is under what conditions is one effect more likely to occur and the other, and under what conditions, for example, can they mutually reinforce each other or not, and so on and so forth. So we're if you like, we're at the very, very early stages to even start thinking about these sort of things. But one thing that's well worth considering is that at the end of the day, the data that David Kalnitsky, he does really some of the most interesting research in my view, but it is based on a very specific experiment in a very specific context that was a long time ago, right? So there is a genuine question to whether the findings that he finds in a rural community in the 70s in Manitoba can be generalized in a much more open economy where issues around globalization and automation and technological unemployment feature, right? Where precarization is a staple, and so on and so forth, right? Okay, but in a way, what we appreciate about David's work is that he's really getting at some of these mechanisms, and that's what we need to do as well. So the people, kind of coming back to our paper, if you like, the people who genuinely think that basic income will give you bargaining power in our sort of current type of economy, they're trying to do, this is effectively a different type of mechanism. So if anything, our paper is trying to separate out some of these things, The next step, if you like, is to do try to get to empirical research and experimental research. I actually have a PhD student in Finland who's doing some lab experiments to try and test out some of this exactly. So with a bit of luck, some more data-driven stuff will come forward in the next year or so.
Okay, next question is from Otto Leto. Otto, unmute and turn your video on.
Oh, hey. So yeah, thanks so much.
You're muted.
Oh, I did click the. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can now. Start over. I accidentally muted you. Sorry.
Okay. Okay. So yeah, it's good to see you all. Jurgen, Simon 1 and Simon 2, and Karl, everybody else. So the paper, as usual, from you is very informative and rich, and there's so many threads there that could be followed and should be followed. At the same time, sometimes I feel a bit like I've witnessed a bull go through a china shop, in the sense that lots of things were in a way attacked and broken down in a way that it's not clear what the constructive way forward is. This is fine. But I think this leads to precarity of basic income research, which is kind of its own form of precarity, is what to do next. But the and also, we've already heard about the tiger and the tabby and the camel. I guess we should add the bull to the list of mammals in this list of basic income animals. But what I want to really focus on is a very simple question here, which is the role of unions and the relation between voice and exit here. Now, of course, it's very easy to say we should combine them, and I'm sure Eric, Olin Wright, and others have contributed constructive ways to do that. But this framing of the issue in your paper is a bit too narrow in terms of it's sort of good for one paper, I suppose, to frame it this narrowly in terms of the relationship being the singular path, is the singular dependency relation between employers and workers, right? So you're focusing on the issue of the dependency relation between them, and the employees are modeled as having very narrow, very narrow preferences in terms of desiring a job, and not necessarily much beyond that, which is fine. But it seems to me that one of the things that bringing in the voice dimension threatens here is first of all the sort of, if we take the idea that employees not only want job, but they want a good job, they also want to have they also need to have the option of choosing their job, and I think the introduction of voice arrangements, whether it's collective bargaining arrangements through unions, or whether it's direct employer sort of channels of communication, might, and especially if we introduce the government sort of government-backed voice channels into the mix, which at least there's this kind of entanglement of countries and other countries which focus largely on these kind of multilateral arrangements. You often get in any sort of entanglement of dependency relations, and this entanglement of dependency relations, you could see it's good for job security often, but it also could be, it sort of creates its own trap, right? So voice could also be a trap in the sense of leading people to be trapped in places where they don't want to be, which was precisely the problem that we wanted to solve. And so if you think that what we're trying to solve is the problem of making sure that people are not stuck in a place where they don't want to be, perhaps we should worry about the trap caused by this entanglement of dependency relations with unions and with government-backed organizations to provide security at the cost of reducing the ability of people to get to a sort of job security that actually would be better for them. So in a way, it could lead to a Nash equilibrium that actually is a trap, a voice trap, not just an exit trap.
Okay, Jurgen and Simon, you're both muted.
So thank you very much. You disappeared there now and then, so I didn't hear your entire argument, unfortunately. But thanks for the remark. And it's I think what you're saying here is in part rather similar to what arguments developed both by Taylor and Lovett. I mean, discussing the limitations of direct voice strategies, and I wouldn't disagree with that. I think, I mean, and also obviously there are these insider outsider issues, and that labor unions won't deal with all relevant interests, and I think, I mean, some of the arguments mentioned there by Jurgen in his introductory remarks, that basic income offers a nice remedies to some of these problems, that it really avoids this intrusiveness, and it might be, I mean, really offers some a good complement to some of these to deal with some of these problems, limitations, and dangers of direct voice strategies, and then perhaps we need to have a closer look at the particular voice mechanisms that you were thinking of here to address your concerns more thoroughly. But I wouldn't want to disagree with any of that. But I do think that it's really crucial, I mean, to have the insights, the empirically grounded insights of empirical comparative welfare state research in this context. I mean, there are some debates here going on in separate compartments, unfortunately. And I do think that, I mean, there are some really key indicators of decommodification and also defamiliarization. I mean, that there's a very firm empirical link here between specific forms of collective class mobilization, direct voice, and these outcomes that would be desirable for someone really wanting to boost these, I mean, the bargaining power of these precarious workers. But of course, I mean, we shouldn't take it for granted that the solutions of the past are also offer the best solutions to our current or future problems. And I'm not, a fan of this kind of nostalgic social democratic program. I mean, I think that the basic income offers some really important, basic income activism and basic income real utopian theorizing here provides some really crucial insights, and it really alerts our attention to important problems, important experiences, and interests that have been, I mean, kind of traditionally left out by proponents of direct voice strategies. now, or Jurgen, do you want to help me or add? Dig deeper into some
I
points.
mean, not sure about helping, but definitely want to add. So, I mean, so kind of literally adding to what Simon was already saying. I mean, of course, we can, you know, we can have a very separate debate about what is the role of unions, if anything, you know, and some people are very much in favor and some people are very much against, et cetera, et cetera. And we can have a similar debate about basic income. But I guess our take is that in order to then have a judgment about, you know, should we go more to the voice direction or more to the exit direction, or should we have a combination of these things? At a very minimum, we need to really understand what's going on. And if anything, you know, one of the things that we had a problem with is that at the basic income side, so to speak, all you got was a very generalizable claim, and then let's just throw that out there and just assume that everything will be hunky-dory and we'll have unicorns and pink rainbows or whatever it all is, right? You know, that's not what's going to happen. So I guess what we're proposing is that, well, let's really get down to the nitty-gritty and look at the pros and cons of the basic income exit strategy, and then let's compare it with the union strategy. And it may well be that for certain people, the balance really is still in favor of basic income. And it may also be that, you know, the balance is in favor of basic income in certain countries rather than in other ones, and so on and so forth, right? I'll just make one final quick call, and this quick comment. This is something that also ties in with something that Karl said before. I mean, you know, Karl basically mentioned and said that, well, you know, you shouldn't think of basic income as being against trade unions, and we should just combine these things. And to some extent, we hear that a lot, right? A lot of people say, well, you know, of course, we want to put these things together, and then the strike fund might be one argument in favor. But there are countering arguments as well. I mean, you know, there's no doubt, I think, in my mind at least, that if you introduce a basic income in certain ways, that this may affect, you know, whether or not people will want to join a trade union. Now, you may think that that's a good thing, and that's a separate type of argument, but at the very minimum, we want to understand these effects, and to simply say we're going to combine them is kind of a bit wishful thinking. What we really want to understand is under what conditions can this combination be achieved in a way that actually does the work it's supposed to be doing, right? So at the end of the day, you know, our paper and our approach is an invitation for many people to basically say, look, let's just take this seriously as a topic in social science, so to speak, in comparative welfare state research, and so on and so forth. And let's do some real work around this and then see how far it gets us, right? And then we can link it back for sure into all the normative considerations as well, right? Whether this is about problems with, you know, domination and the trade unions like you raised and Lovett and Taylor raised, or whether this is really broad, full-on social justice account like Karl is proposing and so on. So all these things are relevant, right, in that sense, right? But let's do the work. Let's do the real work as well.
All right, we are way over time. Thanks to everybody who stayed late. And on behalf of the platypus, the cat, the camel, the bull, and the unicorn, I thank the speakers and everyone who participated, and wish you all a good night or a good morning or afternoon, depending on your time zone.